What happens when a black South African leader and a black American leader condemn South Africa and all of their loyalists for appropriating the apartheid slur and applying it to the state of Israel? Well, it's nothing short of a conceptual earthquake. So be sure to join my colleague Khaled Abu Toameh, who leads a discussion together with these two very brave men, and Rolene Marks, a South African Israeli journalist and commentator on our Middle East. Khaled Abu Toameh and Dan Diker for an unforgettable session on reappropriating Israel and freeing it from apartheid poisonous propaganda.
Hello everyone, it's Dumisani Washington with the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, here with our esteemed panel to discuss the issue of the libel of Israel apartheid and unpack what that means. We have award-winning journalist Khaled Abu Toameh, we have journalist also Rolene Marks with us, and also Africans for Peace coordinator Klaas Mokgomole from South Africa. So welcome everyone, so glad you could be with us.
Thank you.
You are the subject matter experts in this field, obviously, for a number of years now, particularly since the Durban conference of 2001. Israel has had a label affixed to it, which is that it's an apartheid state. Of course, we know that that's not true, but what we want to do is go further than that and talk about what that libel has meant for South Africans, right? What it has meant for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and beyond. So I'm going to start, Khaled, just with you on my side here. You've written about it, obviously prolifically. You have a long storied career here in your journalism. Tell us in your own, however you want to begin to open up this conversation, the whole apartheid controversy. What has it meant? What have you seen on the ground?
Well, I would say that the apartheid-label is part of the larger campaign to delegitimize Israel and demonize Jews in the international community. It's actually being used by Israel's enemies around the world, the Israel haters, to undermine Israel, to depict Israel as a pariah state, as a rogue state, as a state that commits war crimes, genocide, and all of these things. Now, the attempt to establish a link between apartheid and Israel is, causing Israel a lot of damage in the international community, but it's also offending people like me, an Arab citizen of Israel, because it distracts attention from my real problems. I do have problems as a minority with Israel, but it's not apartheid. I have problems regarding services, equal distribution of public funds, unemployment, and things like that. It's very easy to refute the apartheid libel, because if Israel were an apartheid state, I, the Arab Muslim citizen of Israel, would not be allowed to work in a Jewish paper or live in a Jewish neighborhood or go to the same restaurant as Jews or get on a bus where Jews are also there. Or send my daughter to a Jewish school. So it's not apartheid. If you tell me that there is discrimination against minorities inside Israel, I would tell you yes. And that's why I believe that this libel, this apartheid libel, is actually causing me damage, because it diverts attention from the real problems that I'm facing and that I'm trying to solve. And Israel is also trying to solve it. No one denies that the minorities inside Israel are facing challenges and that there are problems. One government does more, one government does less. I've also noticed that this apartheid libel is being promoted by many people who are ignorant around the world, especially on the campuses in the US, in Canada, and elsewhere. They have no idea. They've never been to Israel. They've never been to the Palestinian areas, and they just throw that apartheid accusation with the hope that it will stick. And they're being helped, of course, unfortunately, by some leading human rights organizations, by international agencies, United Nations, some of them linked to the United Nations, human rights groups, and things like that. And as I said before, I see it as part of a larger campaign to delegitimize Israel and demonize Jews. And many of these people who are ignorant, they've never been here. They don't even know what they're talking about. When I challenge people and I ask them to give me examples of apartheid inside Israel, they start scratching their heads. And, you know, and then when I ask them to give me examples of apartheid in the West Bank or in Gaza, some of them, you know, come up with this ridiculous allegation or accusation that, oh, Palestinians in the West Bank cannot vote in the Israeli parliament. And I'm like, excuse me, since when were the Palestinians struggling to become Israeli citizens or vote in the Israeli parliament? The Palestinians do not want to become part of the Israeli political system. The Palestinians are fighting for separation from Israel. So, you know, this is how I see it. And again, I don't see any difference between those who are promoting all kinds of libels against Israel and those who are coming up with this apartheid accusation. It's also, of course, offensive to the South African people. And I'm sure we will hear about it very soon from our dear friend, Mr. Klaas.
And I'd also return to even your initial point, Khaled, about distracting from the substantive things that can be addressed. Rolene, of course, you are both Israeli, South African, born here, lived for a while there in South Africa, and now back here in Israel. You have also a very unique perspective when it comes to the apartheid-label. What are your thoughts initially?
Well, I think let's go back to Durban, because Durban 2001 was that seminal moment that the apartheid analogy, BDS, and everything that is linked with it, the campaign for delegitimization that Khaled was just talking about, really came to the global consciousness. I mean, where else in the world to launch your campaign using apartheid as the central charge? Where better than South Africa, the home of apartheid, where it was born and defeated. It was very, very symbolic of the NGOs, the United Nations, the so-called human rights organizations, to specifically target Durban and that conference against racism, because then you really drive home that message that Israel, as Khaled just said, is a pariah state, is a state that should be set aside from the family of nations, subject to different treatment, which in my opinion is racist itself. When you're using the separation of Israel from the family of nations, using a double standard, using the system of demonization. You know, we have a word for that, and that is the whole thought and the whole strategy behind this campaign. But also, as somebody who grew up during the years of apartheid, it is particularly painful to see the suffering, the narrative, the historical experience of the victims of apartheid being appropriated by these campaigners who don't know what they're talking about. They know that the word apartheid is very, very emotive, very, very sexy for their campaigns on campuses, but they don't know the specifics. They don't know that it was very, very unique to South Africans. They don't know that it was a system of laws legislated by a minority to govern a majority that governed every aspect of a person's life. That is how specific it was, and it's profoundly hurtful and profoundly insulting to see both the South African experience and the Israeli experience being conflated, and the suffering of the victims being appropriated to push a hateful agenda.
Klaas, the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel just took our ambassadors to South Africa, as you know. We had the honor of meeting you, and you spoke with them from across the country. And the purpose of the trip was to, among other things, really understand what the apartheid system was. Of course, they'll be here in June in Israel. And again, you've been speaking campuses, both South Africa, other parts of the world, you've gone to the US. What are your thoughts initially here when you're especially educating others about the misconceptions that both Khaled and Rolene just talked about?
I think, like in every discussion or rather discourse, that we need to firstly define what apartheid is. You know, as Rolene alluded on that apartheid was a system of laws legislated, obviously, to segregate and discriminate, and was legislated to the core by the minority, at that time was the National Party, and making sure that the people of color or the black people sort of don't get certain benefits. It was sort of architectured proper, and it went through parliament to be discussed, because there had to be acts of parliament that need to be passed. Legislature such as Group Areas Act, where they discuss that the blacks or the Indians or the coloreds are going to live in this particular area. And even when they're in that particular area, maybe, for example, if you say Soweto, they are still divided according to tribes. For example, to this day, when you go to Soweto, you realize that there are places like Mzimklope where it's only sort of still the Zulus. Yes, now there's still integration, but most of the people there are sort of Zulus. Then you go to Muletsani, you find the Tswanas. You go to certain places like Dube, you find Ndebeles and stuff like that. And you can see the education system had to be legislated as well. The Bantu education. So you realize that the blacks can only be taught in Afrikaans these particular subjects. They can do religious studies, they can do woodwork, stuff like that. Such universities like Grand Afrikaanse Universiteit, University of Pretoria, where blacks were sort of segregated. Blacks could only go to the University of Natals, University of Limpopo, or at the time was University of Tefuluop. So it was legislated to a point where like every detail was stated, in a point where they were sort of confused if a person is white or a person is black or which category would a person fall in. They even implied what we call the pencil test. So they will take a pencil and put it on your head, and if it stayed in your head, that will mean that you are black. But obviously, if I put a pencil on Rolene's hair, it's not gonna stay. It's gonna fall off, because it doesn't like have the afro. So it sort of sickened me sometimes when you go to these college campuses and people want to educate you on apartheid, but they don't really understand what apartheid was. And they say a number of things about Israel, and when you say, look guys, Israel can never be apartheid. We don't disagree that yes, there is a conflict in the Middle East, but the fact that you are going to lie to the rest of the student population on campus and say Israel's an apartheid state, that's undermining our history as South Africans, because you don't understand what went down, meaning you are willing to sort of sell our history short or for a lower price so that you can achieve your own personal goals.
Khaled, I've noticed over the years, and you've pointed these things out as well in your writing, that even the weaponization of the term, right? There are Arab Israelis, right? And some choose to refer to themselves as Palestinian, and of course the Palestinian territories. We also talked about sometimes how the ones who are the detractors use the term in the way to divide. In other words, to divide even the Arab Israeli population. As you said, there's a minority population. I'm a minority population in the United States. There's things you have to fight for. There's things that there may be injustices that have to be resolved. And then, of course, a narrative like that comes and kind of confuses everything. Khaled, what do you see in terms of identity when it comes to that Arab Israeli population that's here? Is there a tension in terms of what's happening and what they see going on in the Palestinian territories?
Since 1948, the Arab population inside Israel has been largely loyal towards Israel. Back in 1948, when Israel was established, 150,000 Arabs stayed inside Israel, including my grandparents. Today, we are 2 million. And since then, since 1948, we, the Arab population of Israel, have been loyal citizens of Israel. Now, what does loyalty mean? It doesn't necessarily mean that I identify with Jewish symbols or that I wake up in the morning and sing the Israeli national anthem, We respect them. We have no problem with them. Loyalty for me means that I'm a law-abiding citizen, that I recognize Israel's right to exist, that I believe in wonderful things that Israel stands for, and that I'm fighting for integration into Israel. So we, the minority, the Arab minority inside Israel, are fighting for integration into Israel. We have no political demands from Israel. We're not saying we want a Palestinian state inside Israel. Now, many of us consider ourselves to be part of the Palestinian people. And that's why some of us call ourselves Palestinian citizens of Israel. I don't personally use that term, by the way, because it creates confusion. I'm an Israeli citizen. The Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza are Palestinian citizens. But what is the position of the mainstream or the majority of the Arabs inside Israel? We want to see peace between our state, Israel, and our people, the Palestinians. In that regard, we share the views of many Jews also inside Israel who want some kind of a solution. Whatever they agree on, we accept. But as I said, we would like to see self-determination for our people over there. We want to see a good life for our people in the West Bank and Gaza, but we want to stay inside Israel. We, the Arab citizens of Israel. Why? For two reasons. Number one, it's my home, and there's no reason why I should go and live in Ramallah or Gaza if I don't have an address over there and I never lived there. And number two, we still feel much more comfortable inside Israel than we do over there, despite the challenges and the difficulties that we face as a minority. Now, when I talk about these difficulties and challenges, I'm referring to three areas where we, the Arab citizens, feel the heat, I would say. Employment, infrastructure, and allocation of public funding. Now, again, I'm not saying Israel hasn't done anything for its non-Jewish community. I'm just saying Israel is not doing enough. And Israel is also saying, yes, we're not doing enough, and I find that encouraging. And we've seen over the past 74 years that one government does more, one government does less, but at least there is an attempt to narrow the gap between Jews and Arabs inside Israel. That's actually an Israeli interest. It is in Israel's interest to embrace its non-Jewish citizens and not alienate them, especially given the fact that the majority of us do not challenge Israel's right to exist. We are not in conflict with our state, Israel. We are demanding, jobs. We're demanding more opportunities inside Israel. We're saying we want to see more public building and things like that for the Arab community. And that does not make us an enemy of Israel, nor does the fact that we identify with the aspirations of our people over there. It's okay to be to identify or express solidarity with the Palestinian right to self-determination. That doesn't mean that I'm anti-Israel. I'm one of those who have been arguing, Dumisani, for many years, that you can be both pro-Israel and pro-Palestine. Being pro-Israel does not necessarily mean that you're anti-Palestinian, and being pro-Israel does not necessarily mean that we condone everything Israeli governments do. And being pro-Palestinian does not necessarily mean that I condone terrorist attacks and violence and things like that. It means that I support a good life for my people, the Palestinians. It means that I want to see a better economy, an end to corruption, a better education for my people over there, a dignified life. And being pro-Palestinian, similarly, does not necessarily mean that you're anti-Israel. So that's the approach of myself and of many people inside Israel, the Arab citizens of Israel. We are the most pragmatic and moderate Muslims or Arabs in the Middle East. Why? Because we were raised inside Israel. We got the right education. We went to Israeli schools. We learned according to the Israeli curricula. We were raised, at Israeli universities and things like that. And this is what happens when you get the right education. If someone like me went to Birzeit University in the West Bank or to the Islamic University in Gaza, I would be talking differently. But I look at the Arab community inside Israel, and that gives me hope. It shows that Arabs are pragmatic and moderate when they, because they live inside Israel and they get the right education.
I want to. So much of what Khaled just touched on reminds me, Klaas, of your role, and when we're talking about it, you're over South Africans for Peace. And you were saying that very much some of the same things Khaled was saying. That doesn't mean you're anti-Israel, anti-Palestine. You want to see health, strength, prosperity, everyone. So you want what's peaceful. As Khaled was talking, I was thinking about, once again, the apartheid smear confusing issues. So here he is. He said, I'm a minority in Israel. These are the things that I'm fighting for, but I'm an Israeli citizen. That wasn't the case during apartheid. When the black South Africans were protesting, they were being jailed, they were being beaten, they were being killed. There was not the opportunity to petition the government. So when you hear something like what Khaled is saying, and we juxtaposing it to what was happening during apartheid South Africa, what is that? What are you thinking along those lines?
I think what Khaled is saying basically proves that Israel is a democracy. Because in a democracy, you have press freedom. In a democracy, you are allowed to criticize the government. And you are allowed to have a march or a boycott or a protest. Recently, there was a protest. Obviously, thousands of people having disagreement with what the government is deciding with the Supreme Court.
Yes.
And we didn't see bloodshed, we didn't see people sort of being shot.
Yes.
But if such a thing was to happen in South Africa, we're going to have obviously a repeat of like 1976 massacre, the Weaponization massacre that took place as well. And the number of things that happened in South African apartheid when the blacks decided to take it to the streets, whether it was the students, whether it was the youth, whether it was the women's league, what they tried to do was to sort of hold placards and go to the streets and sort of voice out that dissatisfaction with the government. And how the government replied, they replied with live ammunition, replied with arrests. And obviously, it wasn't a nice experience for the black community in South Africa. And that went to prove that South Africa wasn't a democracy. South Africa was obviously under apartheid. And people were sort of managed that way because it was apartheid. And you come to the Middle East, to come to Israel in particular, we don't see that. It shows that it's a democracy, and it's really shocking when people don't see that. I don't know if maybe they don't do proper research about Israel, or they just ignorant. And if they're ignorant, then we still have a very long way to go.
Each of you, Rolene, all of you obviously have both a local and a international perspective in terms of comparing, whether comparing democracies, we're talking about what's going on college campuses, particularly in the West and Canada and US and in the UK. Speak to, for a moment, what that means overall. We have students, particularly in the West, who have been now over a period of years somewhat indoctrinated with this, right? We can all tell stories about people, as Khaled had mentioned before, of course, you and Klaas, I'm sorry, I have to edit that, have all experienced that in a certain way. What does that mean to you? When you're talking to people, as we say, who've never been here, who don't really know, but they're in the UK, they're in Canada, they're in UC Irvine, wherever. What is that, when you see that level of passion, right, but not connected to anything factual, what is it that you perceive when you're actually watching that?
Well, it worries me greatly because, kola kavod, or kudos to the young people on campuses who are turned on by social justice issues and wanting to make the world a better place. But when it comes to the conflict between Israel and our Palestinian neighbors, and both Khaled and Klaas hit the nail on the head, you don't have to choose. Why should you choose between being pro-Palestinian and pro-Israel? Shouldn't you be pro both? Shouldn't you be pro peace, pro-sorting out the conflict. South Africa, apartheid did not fall because of boycotts, divestment and sanctions, contrary to what the BDS movement, which is very active on college campuses, want people to believe. It fell because of brave leadership wanting to engage in dialogue. Dialogue is what brings peace. Bridges built between people is what brings peace. There are so many projects in Israel between Israelis and Palestinians on the ground that you never get to hear about because it's just not sexy enough, and it doesn't fit that whole social justice narrative. But peace, I believe, will not be built from governments down. It will be built between people up. And college campuses, and it always amazes me because don't these countries have their own internal issues to deal with? Why import a conflict from somewhere else in the world that they evidently know very little of? Why import that conflict onto their college campuses, which creates an environment where Jewish students and pro-Israel students and faculty are feeling more and more marginalized, and they're feeling more and more unsafe to come to school. Next month, in March, you'll have what is called Israel Apartheid Week on campuses around the world. And it's a week that is dedicated to absolute demonization and slurs against the Jewish state. And invariably what happens is that pro-Israel, Jewish students, faculty don't want to come to campus that week because they literally feel for their personal safety. And, we hear those horrendous cries of from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, which essentially means the eradication of Israel. We'll hear the cries for intifada, which calls for bloodshed. We'll hear those calls to dismantle the Jewish state. And what is very important to note is that during the apartheid regime, people called for the end of the apartheid regime. They didn't call for the end of South Africa. Whereas what we're hearing on campuses around the world is for the eradication of Israel. Let me be clear, Israel's not a perfect state. We have issues. We have issues, as Khaled has said, about minority rights and needing to do better. But how does creating an environment that is so inflammatory on campuses regarding a conflict in another part of the world, ignoring your own domestic issues at home, contribute to finding meaningful solutions?
Khaled, I want to do just one more phase of this. And you had alluded to it, of course, Klaas as well, that the false narrative, among many other things, keeps even very right-minded people from dealing with substantive issues, right? So we've talked before about the situation, for example, with the United Nations Human Rights Council, those types of things, focusing almost maniacally on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, while things are, whether it's the genocide in Nigeria and so on and so forth, right, with the slaves in Libya, these things that we've talked about, or the treatment of the people in Gaza, those types of things. Khaled, you've written again about those types of things. Articulate for us again what this means. Once again, not only is that narrative not correct, Israel apartheid, but these other things, whether it's the Palestinian territories or the areas in the world that are almost completely ignored because this takes all the air out of the room.
I've met many of these people on the campuses who call themselves pro-Palestinian. And when I asked them, what are your messages? All I heard from them were awful things about Israel. Israel is an apartheid state, Israel is a racist state, Israel commits war crimes and genocide and things like that. I did not hear from them one word about the Palestinians. I did not hear from them one word about how to help the Palestinians living in Gaza, for example, under Hamas or under the Palestinian Authority. I discovered that it's more about hating Israel than helping the Palestinians. So how can you be pro-Palestinian and all what you are doing is spewing hatred against Israel on the campuses? And I told some of these people, if you really want to help the Palestinians, as you claim you do, since you're called the pro-Palestinian camp, why don't you come to Gaza and defend the rights of women and gay people living under Hamas. That's called being pro-Palestinian. Or why don't you come to the West Bank and promote democracy and freedom of speech under the PLO, the Palestinian Authority, that does not exist, by the way. The freedom of speech and freedom. Why don't you do something to help the Palestinians? That's called being pro-Palestinian, and not just hiding at a campus and spewing hatred against Israel. But you know, again, I did not see anything positive from these people. Calling for boycotts and divestment and sanctions does not really help the Palestinians. It actually hurts the Palestinians. And of course, it sabotages the peace process or any prospects for reviving the peace process. If you're calling for boycotting Israel and isolating Israel, and if you are criminalizing normalization with Israel, then how can any Arab be seen sitting at a negotiating table with Israel? All of these I refuse to call them pro-Palestinian people, by the way. All of these anti-Israel people on the campuses are actually empowering the radicals in the Middle East. They're empowering and emboldening Hamas and Islamic Jihad and all of those who seek to destroy Israel and all of those who are opposed to any peace process with Israel. If we want to talk about apartheid in the Middle East, by the way, why don't we look at Lebanon? What's happening in Lebanon? There's a law that bans Palestinians living there from working in more than 45 professions. How come no one talks about that apartheid? How come no one talks about the fact that Palestinians are barred from from receiving citizenship in most of the Arab countries, or even buying property? Can you imagine if the Israeli Knesset, the Israeli parliament, passed a law tomorrow morning that says that an Arab Muslim citizen of Israel is not allowed to work as a journalist or as a carpenter or as a nurse or as a doctor? What will happen? The UN Security Council would meet, and within 5 minutes he would have 13 resolutions condemning Israel. But it happens in Lebanon, it's okay. It happens in most of the Arab countries. People turn a blind eye to it. They don't want to see. Israel is being singled out. Israel is being targeted. And as I said before, this is part of a larger campaign to isolate Israel, to vilify Israel, to demonize Jews. This is part of the overall Palestinian strategy these days, by the way. It is to isolate Israel in the international community. By accusing Israel of being an apartheid state, the Palestinian leadership is hoping that the international community would distance itself from Israel, would vomit Israel, would boycott Israel, and that would ultimately lead to the collapse of Israel. That's the end goal. So here, it's not even about ending apartheid inside Israel, it's about ending Israel's presence, Israel's existence, so to speak. So these people, they're not really concerned about, what's really happening inside Israel. They're actually promoting the narrative that says Israel has no right to exist over here.
Klaas, you have a very extraordinary story in which you came to Israel for the first time believing that Israel was the apartheid state. You were actually organizing on campuses. You were part of that student group that, as we've been talking about here, was making it very uncomfortable for Jewish students and pro-Israel students. You came, you saw that it wasn't true, and now you use your very, very strong and powerful voice in the opposite way. You are still fighting for justice, but you recognize that how Israel was being demonized wasn't the case. Why was that so important for you to actually join that fight as a person of justice?
Look, I think it's important to sort of educate. I don't want people to fall in the same trap that I sort of fell in. I was very active on campus, and my space, my political space, was sort of infiltrated by these anti-Israel organizations. So from student government on my campus, we sort of took resolutions that we're going to boycott anything Israeli related on our campus, because we had that narrative that believed that Israel was an apartheid state. And I can tell you that some people still have that belief, but the most important thing is to sort of educate them and clarify them on that. Most of the spaces are sort of infiltrated and they're politicized. You look at the United Nations, they are politicized. Look at the Amnesty International, they politicize those spaces. And when the moment they're sort of infiltrated, they lose the main focus, they lose the main goal. As Rolene spoke earlier, that South Africa reached this point where we call it now a rainbow nation because there was a compromise. There were people, there were leaders that were sort of willing to sit and negotiate. And how did they get there? They got there by understanding each other. They got there by sort of opening their minds to new ideas. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to make sure that the international community is aware of the situation and the international community sort of understand how to sort of come up with the resolutions that are going to be beneficial for everyone.
So now, which takes us to this next thing, international community, let's be specific, the United Nations Human Rights Council, the International Criminal Court, which in our country, in the United States, Ilhan Omar, who was formerly a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the vice chair of the Subcommittee on Africa, right? This is the irony. A Somali immigrant to America, she's now serving in Congress, and she spends much of her time demonizing Israel and not really bringing to prominence what's going on even in Africa. The vice chair of the Subcommittee on Africa, you just alluded to this, Klaas, that if there can be real conversations, real dialogue, maybe we come to real solutions. But what it seems like we're dealing with now, as these reports after reports are coming out, calling Israel an apartheid state, demonizing Israel, to the exclusion of so many other things that are going on in our world where people are actually suffering. What will it take, and just for anyone can jump in, what will it take for that to actually happen? What Klaas was saying, how do we get past that, the demonization of Israel, to really actually having real conversations about human rights abuses and how we address those?
Well, I think something quite extraordinary is happening on the African continent. African countries are realizing that when it comes to the conflict between Israel and her neighbors, why pick a side? Why even get involved? You can be pro both people and their national aspirations. We are seeing African countries more and more opening up to Israel and wanting Israel to at least have a presence in their institutions like the African Union. We know that South Africa is working overtime to try and get Israel's observer status, and by observer status, we mean literally just having a seat in the room. No voting on resolutions, no proposal of resolutions, but it's very, very symbolic to have Israel present in that room. With regards to institutions like the United Nations, I think the founders of the UN, which used to be at the vanguard of human rights, must be spinning in their graves. We need only look at the commissioners of inquiry and who sits on that UN Human Rights Council to see what their agendas are. We have 3 people sitting on a commission of inquiry at the United Nations Human Rights Council with the mandate of investigating the crimes of apartheid, as per the words of their mandate, who each have a history of anti-Semitism, who have been called out about their history of anti-Semitism. We have human rights organizations like Amnesty International, like Human Rights Watch, who have also demonstrated their agenda. Ken Roth, who used to be the director of Human Rights Watch, has been sanctioned for his obsession with tweeting about the Jewish state. Even the founding father of Human Rights Watch wrote an op-ed for the New York Times saying, this organization, which I founded to protect human rights, is going down a very, very nefarious anti-Israel road, and I worry about it. Amnesty International, who couldn't even bring themselves to talk about their report on apartheid, which they completely rewrote the definition at great insult to South Africans, couldn't even bring themselves to sit in Jerusalem and release the report. They couldn't even acknowledge Jerusalem. And when questioned about some of their accusations and the fact that they had negated the opinions of their own Jerusalem-based office, got uptight. Agnes, I forget her surname, she's the director of Amnesty International. She too has a history. Francesca Albanese of the United Nations, she's the special rapporteur for the Palestinians, shares some of the most grotesque Nazi-like anti-Israel rhetoric. So do we trust these institutions when it comes to issues of human rights? We only need to look at Amnesty International, who blamed Ukraine for Russia's invasion. You know, victim blaming seems to be becoming a part of their ongoing lexicon.
You mentioned Ken Roth, if I'm not mistaken, has just joined the faculty at Harvard. I know there was some controversy around that, which for me underscores much of what's going on Western college campuses, that the demonization of Israel, even sometimes the outright anti-Semitism, is not only not being dealt with, as well as the apartheid lie and those types of things, but unfortunately is being either encouraged, right? It's being used as a litmus test in terms of these young people's social justice, credentials, if you will. To me is another reason why it's so key and crucial to shine a light on what's actually happening there when it comes to demonizing Israel, when it comes to delegitimizing Israel, again, and ignoring the other things that are happening in our world when it comes to human rights and justice issues. Part of the context of this discussion has much to do with how particularly the weaponization of language has exploited both Black South Africans as well as Black Americans when it comes to demonizing Israel. You have to go back to the 60s and the 70s and how Israel's enemies would focus in on the Black American community, wanting to tie in the racism that was typifying what the civil rights struggle was about, fighting against that, and attempting to draw that and a parallel to what was going on with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This was true in the late 60s. This was true in the 1970s, 1975. A Black American Israel organization known as Basic Black Americans to Support Israel Committee, founded by Dr. King's friends and family after he had been assassinated several years earlier, was pushing it back against then what was a UN Resolution 3379, Zionism is a form of racism. This actually proceeded before you get obviously to the Durban 2001. And what was the goal? The goal had nothing to do with peace in the region. The goal had nothing to do with a Palestinian state or self-determination. It had everything to do with demonizing Israel, and it used the Black American community. It used those civil rights leaders. It used a legitimate struggle for justice there in the States and then later on in South Africa to demonize Israel. This is something that must be understood, that as we're pushing back against the apartheid lie, we are also pushing forward towards real justice and real conversations around really resolving conflict. So we just want to make that point and thank again our amazing guests for coming and discussing this with us on today from the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Thank you so much for joining us.
Khaled, that was a real head spinner of a discussion on apartheid. And you have these, when you have Pastor Dumisani Washington and Klaas Mokgomole saying that South Africa's way off base, the apartheid analogy is completely in the framework of what we call apartheid anti-Semitism, we have a totally new discussion, don't we?
Yeah, Dan, I can tell you, I spent a number of days with these two guys, the man from South Africa and the pastor from America. And I can tell you that, after spending time in Israel and after spending time even in Bethlehem under the Palestinian Authority, their views about Israel were reinforced. They came out with this very strong statement that there is absolutely no apartheid inside Israel. This is nothing but a libel, a blood libel against Israel. It's being used as a weapon to delegitimize Israel and demonize Jews. It was very interesting to hear it from both of them, arguing with Palestinians, with Arabs inside Israel, with non-Jews inside Israel about this whole issue. So it was a very interesting discussion, and I recommend everyone watch it.
Yeah, please watch Khaled Abu Toameh and his co-host Dan Diker as we engage in the inside-out understanding of the Middle East, and the apartheid slur is no different than all of the other dramatic issues happening in our region. So please join us in Our Middle East. We look forward to having you.